The summer of 1878 arrived with a vengeance in Cottonwood Springs, Texas, bringing heat so intense it seemed to bend the very air above the dusty main street. Dust devils danced between weathered buildings as Dorothy Turner stepped off the stagecoach, her threadbare carpetbag clutched tightly in one hand, her mother's tattered recipe book in the other. At 22, with no family and few prospects, Dorothy had traveled west on nothing more than a desperate prayer and the last of her savings. "Miss, you getting off or not?" the stagecoach driver called impatiently. "Got a schedule to keep." Dorothy nodded quickly, gathering her skirts to avoid the mud that somehow persisted despite the merciless heat. Her once fine blue dress, now faded and mended in several places, clung uncomfortably to her slender frame as she surveyed the frontier town that would be her new home if she could find work before her meager funds ran out. The town wasn't much a general store, saloon, small church, and assortment of wooden buildings that looked as though they might surrender to the next strong wind. But it was here, in this dusty corner of nowhere, that she'd heard they needed help at the Lazy Bee ranch house. The advertisement had been specific: cook needed, must handle large meals in rustic conditions, references required. Dorothy had none of the latter, but her cooking had once been praised by the finest families in Charleston before the war, and subsequent hardships had taken everything. She made her way to the general store, where a bell jangled cheerfully as she entered. The proprietor, a balding man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, looked up from his ledger. "Afternoon, miss. New to town?" he asked, sizing her up with practiced eyes. "Yes, sir. Just arrived. I'm looking for directions to the Lazy Bee Ranch. I understand they're in need of a cook." The man's eyebrows rose slightly. "That they are, since old Mrs. Wilkins up and died last month. Been trying to make do, but from what I hear, those cowboys are about ready to revolt over the food situation," he chuckled. "You aiming to apply?" "I am," Dorothy said, straightening her shoulders. "I'm an experienced cook." "Well, the Lazy Bee is about 5 miles north of town. Owner's name is Frank Blackburn. Widower with a young boy about 8 years old, I reckon. Good man, fair employer." He paused. "Though I should warn you, miss, ranch life ain't for the faint-hearted. Especially for a lady who looks like she might be more at home at a social tea." Dorothy smiled tightly. "I assure you, sir, I'm stronger than I appear." The storekeeper shrugged. "Sheriff Miller's heading out that way shortly. Might be able to give you a ride if you're set on going today." An hour later, Dorothy found herself bouncing along in Sheriff Miller's wagon, her carpetbag at her feet, the vast Texas landscape stretching endlessly around them. The sheriff was a taciturn man who seemed content with silence, which suited Dorothy fine as she rehearsed what she would say to this Mr. Blackburn. "There it is," the sheriff finally said, pointing to a collection of buildings in the distance. "The Lazy Bee." As they drew closer, Dorothy could make out a respectable main house, a large barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings. Several horses milled about in a corral, and in the distance, cattle grazed on the sparse summer grass. It was larger than she'd imagined, and for a moment, doubt crept in. Could she really manage cooking for what looked to be a sizable ranch operation? The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the main house, and Sheriff Miller helped her down. "Good luck to you, Miss Turner," he said, tipping his hat before turning the wagon around. Dorothy stood alone in the yard, dust settling around her boots. Before she could gather the courage to approach the house, the front door swung open, and a small whirlwind erupted from inside. "Pa! Pa! Sheriff's gone already!" A boy of about 8 with unruly brown hair and a face smudged with dirt ran toward the barn, then skidded to a halt when he spotted Dorothy. "Who are you?" he demanded, eyeing her suspiciously. "My name is Dorothy Turner. I've come about the cook position," she replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The boy's eyes widened. "Really? You gonna cook for us? Can you make pie? Mrs. Wilkins made terrible pie, tough as leather." He made a face. Despite her nervousness, Dorothy laughed. "I do make pie. Very good pie, if I may say so." "Joshua," a deep voice called from the barn. "Who are you talking to?" "A lady, Pa, says she's here to cook." A tall figure emerged from the barn shadows, and Dorothy felt her breath catch slightly. Frank Blackburn was not what she had expected. The storekeeper's description of a good man had hardly prepared her for the imposing figure now striding toward her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his shirt. His face was tanned from long days in the sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he was in his early 30s. A neatly trimmed beard framed a mouth currently set in a questioning line. "Miss," he said, removing his hat as he approached, "can I help you?" Dorothy swallowed hard. "Mr. Blackburn? I'm Dorothy Turner. I've come about the cook position you advertised in the paper." Frank Blackburn studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Dorothy fought the urge to fidget under his gaze. "Miss Turner," he finally said, "I appreciate you coming all this way, but I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding. We need someone experienced with ranch cooking, someone hardy enough for the work." Heat that had nothing to do with the Texas sun rose in Dorothy's cheeks. "I assure you, Mr. Blackburn, I am more than qualified. I've cooked for large households before, and I'm not afraid of hard work." "She says she makes good pie, Pa," Joshua interjected, clearly on Dorothy's side already. Frank ran a hand through his hair, looking torn. "Miss Turner, where did you come from?" "Charleston, most recently," she admitted. "But I've been working my way west for some time." "Charleston?" His eyebrows rose. "South Carolina? That's a mighty long way." "Yes, it is," she agreed simply, not wanting to elaborate on the circumstances that had driven her so far from home. He sighed, looking from her to his son and back again. "The work's hard, the hours long, and the pay modest. We're 10 men at roundup time, 6 regularly. Breakfast before dawn, dinner at noon, supper after work. You'd have Sundays to yourself, unless there's a cattle drive." Hope rose in Dorothy's chest. "I understand, sir. And you'd live here, in the house." "There's a small room off the kitchen." He looked uncomfortable. "It's proper enough you'd have your privacy. Joshua and I have rooms upstairs." "That sounds perfectly acceptable?" Frank still looked doubtful. "I can't offer you a position without knowing if you can actually cook, Miss Turner." "That's fair," Dorothy agreed. "Perhaps I could prepare dinner tonight, as a demonstration of my abilities?" Joshua bounced excitedly. "Can she, Pa? Please?" Frank Blackburn looked at his eager son, then back at Dorothy. "Very well," he said finally. "One meal. We'll decide after that." And so, Dorothy found herself being led into the kitchen of the Lazy Bee Ranch House, her future hanging on one meal. The kitchen was large and well-equipped by frontier standards, with a substantial wood-burning stove, a pump for water, and ample workspace. The pantry, however, when she inspected it, was in disarray, poorly stocked and disorganized. "The men have been taking turns," Frank explained, looking slightly embarrassed. "None of them particularly gifted in the culinary arts." "I can see that," Dorothy murmured, surveying a pathetic collection of withered vegetables. "Mr. Blackburn, is there a garden?" "Behind the house. It's been neglected some, but there should still be vegetables." Dorothy nodded decisively. "Very well, I'll need about 3 hours to prepare a proper meal." "Will that suffice?" Frank looked surprised at her businesslike tone. "That's fine, Miss Turner. Joshua can show you where everything is." He hesitated. "We're not expecting anything fancy, just good, filling food." As he left, Dorothy rolled up her sleeves. First, she sent Joshua to the garden with instructions to bring back whatever looked edible. While he was gone, she tied an apron around her waist and began organizing the kitchen to her liking. By the time Joshua returned with an assortment of vegetables, some past their prime but salvageable, she had a plan. "What are you making?" Joshua asked, perching on a stool to watch her work. "Beef stew with dumplings, cornbread, and peach cobbler," she replied, already slicing onions with practiced precision. Joshua's eyes widened. "Real cobbler? With a crust on top like a blanket?" Dorothy smiled at his description. "Exactly like that." For the next few hours, she worked steadily, transforming simple ingredients into something special. She remembered her mother's words, "Food made with love always tastes better." As she worked, Joshua peppered her with questions about her life, where she'd come from, and how she'd learned to cook. Dorothy answered carefully, sharing stories of learning at her mother's side, but avoiding the painful details of her family's downfall after the war, her parents' deaths, and the desperate circumstances that had driven her west. Joshua, in turn, told her about life on the ranch, about his father, and about his mother who had died when he was just 4. "Pa says I look like her," he confided, "but I don't remember her much." "That must be hard," Dorothy said gently, sliding the cobbler into the oven. Joshua shrugged with the resilience of childhood. "Pa does his best, but he works awful hard, and he's no good at cooking." He wrinkled his nose. "He burns everything." By late afternoon, delicious aromas filled the kitchen. Dorothy had set the long table in the dining room with the ranch's mismatched but clean dishes, and a bouquet of wildflowers Joshua had gathered stood in a mason jar at the center. Frank returned from his work looking skeptical, but his expression changed when he entered the house. "What's that smell?" he asked, inhaling deeply. "Miss Turner made stew and cornbread and cobbler," Joshua announced proudly, as though he'd had a hand in its creation. Frank gave Dorothy an appraising look. "Smells promising," he allowed. The ranch hands filed in shortly after 6 men of varying ages, all looking tired, dusty, and hungry. They eyed Dorothy with curiosity but were quickly distracted by the food being laid out before them. "Gentlemen," Frank said, "this is Miss Turner. She's prepared dinner tonight as a test of her cooking skills." The men murmured greetings, their eyes already on the steaming pot of stew Dorothy was setting on the table. The meal passed in relative silence, broken only by requests to pass dishes and the occasional appreciative grunt. Dorothy watched anxiously from her place at the far end of the table, barely touching her own food. When every man had cleaned his plate and several had gone back for seconds, she finally allowed herself to relax a little. "Miss Turner," one of the older hands said, pushing back from the table, "that was the finest meal I've had since leaving my mama's table in Tennessee." The others nodded in agreement, and even Frank looked impressed. "The bread," Joshua announced with the authority of a food critic, "tastes like love, Pa. We should keep her." A flush crept up Frank's neck at his son's artless comment. "Joshua," he admonished gently. "Well, it does," the boy insisted. "Mrs. Wilkins's bread was hard as rocks. Miss Turner's is soft and warm, like when you tuck me in at night." The cowboys chuckled, and Dorothy felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the kitchen's heat. She hadn't realized how desperately she'd needed this job, this place, until this moment. Frank cleared his throat. "Miss Turner, if you're still interested in the position, it's yours. You can start tomorrow." Relief washed over her. "Thank you, Mr. Blackburn. I accept." "Hooray!" Joshua cheered, earning another gentle reprimand from his father about table manners. As the men filed out to the porch for their evening pipes, thanking Dorothy as they passed, she began clearing the table. Frank lingered, helping to stack plates in a way that suggested it wasn't his usual habit. "Miss Turner," he said, his voice low, so Joshua, who was now playing with carved wooden animals in the corner, couldn't hear. "I feel I should warn you, this is a hard life out here. Very different from what you might be accustomed to." Dorothy paused, a stack of plates in her hands. "Mr. Blackburn, I appreciate your concern, but please don't mistake my appearance for fragility. The life I left behind was far harder in many ways than honest work on a ranch." Something in her tone must have convinced him, because he nodded slowly. "Very well. But if at any point you find the situation unsuitable—" "I won't," she interrupted, then flushed at her own boldness. "I mean, I'm certain I'll adapt quickly." Frank studied her for a moment longer, then nodded again. "We rise at 4:30. Breakfast is at 5. The men like coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in." "I'll remember that," Dorothy said, smiling slightly. As he turned to go, she added, "And Mr. Blackburn, thank you for the opportunity." He paused at the door. "Miss Turner, if that cobbler tastes half as good as it smells, I should be thanking you." That night, in the small but clean room off the kitchen that was now hers, Dorothy unpacked her few belongings. The room was simple, a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a small mirror on the wall, but it was more privacy and comfort than she'd had in months. She carefully placed her mother's recipe book on the nightstand and said a silent prayer of thanks. Tomorrow would begin her new life at the Lazy Bee Ranch. She had no way of knowing that it would change everything. The weeks that followed settled into a routine. Dorothy rose before dawn each day to start breakfast biscuits, gravy, eggs, and coffee, strong enough to satisfy even the most demanding cowboys. She spent her mornings baking bread, preparing the midday dinner, and beginning preparations for supper. In between, she gradually brought order to the chaotic pantry, planted herbs outside the kitchen door, and made lists of supplies for the weekly trip to town. The ranch hands quickly became devoted to her cooking, offering to chop wood or haul water in exchange for extra portions or special treats. Joshua became her shadow whenever he wasn't in school or helping with age-appropriate ranch chores, eager to learn cooking skills and even more eager to sample the results. Frank Blackburn remained more reserved. He was unfailingly polite, thanking her for each meal and occasionally commenting on a particularly successful dish, but he maintained a careful distance. Dorothy often caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression unreadable. One evening in late July, Dorothy was kneading bread dough when Frank entered the kitchen. She looked up, surprised. He rarely came to the kitchen except at mealtimes. "Miss Turner," he said, removing his hat. "I'll be riding into town tomorrow for supplies. Is there anything you need?" Dorothy wiped her hands on her apron. "Actually, yes, I've made a list." She retrieved it from a drawer. "If it's too much—" "It's no trouble," he said, taking the list. His fingers brushed hers, and she felt a small jolt at the contact. "You've made a real difference here," he added abruptly. "The men's morale is better. And Joshua—" He glanced toward the doorway where the sound of his son's laughter could be heard from the porch. "I haven't seen him this happy in a long time." Dorothy felt warmth spread through her chest. "He's a wonderful boy, Mr. Blackburn. You should be very proud." A ghost of a smile touched Frank's lips. "I am." He looked down at the list in his hand. "Sugar, flour, cinnamon. Planning something special?" "Apple pies," she admitted. "I saw the trees in the orchard are nearly ready for harvest." "My wife planted those trees," he said quietly. "She loved apple pie." It was the first time he'd mentioned his late wife to Dorothy, and she wasn't sure how to respond. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said finally. Frank nodded, his expression distant. "It's been 4 years now. Sometimes feels like yesterday. Other times—" He trailed off, then seemed to remember himself. "Forgive me, Miss Turner. I didn't mean to burden you with personal matters." "It's no burden," Dorothy said gently. "Grief is a long road." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, at her understanding. "Yes," he agreed. "It is." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the rhythmic sound of Dorothy's hands returning to the bread dough. "Well," Frank said finally, tucking the list into his pocket, "I should let you get back to your work. Good night, Miss Turner." "Good night, Mr. Blackburn." After he left, Dorothy found her hands trembling slightly as she shaped the dough into loaves. There was something about Frank Blackburn that unsettled her, not in an unpleasant way, but in a manner that made her increasingly aware of him as more than just her employer. It was foolish, she knew. She was here to work, to build a new life for herself, not to develop tender feelings for a man who still clearly mourned his wife. The next morning, as Frank prepared to leave for town, Joshua ran out to the yard. "Pa, can Miss Turner come too, please?" Frank looked surprised. "Son, Miss Turner has work to do here." "Actually," Dorothy said, stepping onto the porch, "I've prepared cold meats and bread for the men's dinner. There's nothing that can't wait until I return." She hadn't planned on going to town, but the prospect of a change of scenery was suddenly appealing. "That is, if you don't mind the company." Frank hesitated, then nodded. "We'd welcome your company, wouldn't we, Joshua?" "Yes," the boy cheered, already climbing into the wagon. The ride to town was pleasant, with Joshua chattering happily between them. Dorothy found herself stealing glances at Frank's profile as he drove, noting the strong line of his jaw beneath his beard, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled at his son's antics. In town, they split up Frank to handle ranch business, Dorothy to select groceries, with Joshua bouncing between them. At the general store, Dorothy was carefully examining spices when she overheard two women talking nearby. "That's her, the new cook at the Lazy Bee," one whispered none too quietly. "Quite pretty, don't you think?" "Too pretty to just be a cook, if you ask me," the other replied with a sniff. "Mark my words. She's setting her cap for Frank Blackburn, widower with a prosperous ranch. She wouldn't be the first to try." Dorothy's cheeks burned with embarrassment and anger. She kept her back to the gossips, pretending not to hear as they continued their speculation about her character and intentions. Poor Margaret, barely cold in her grave, and already women circling like vultures, one lamented. 4 years isn't exactly fresh grief, the other pointed out. And that boy needs a mother. Frank needs a wife, though I'd hoped he might look at my Harriet. Dorothy hurriedly finished her shopping and stepped outside, needing fresh air. She nearly collided with Frank, who was coming to find her. "Miss Turner, are you all right? You look flushed." "I'm fine," she said quickly. "Just warm in the store." Frank frowned, clearly not believing her. "Did someone say something to upset you?" "No, truly, I'm fine." She forced a smile. "Did you finish your business?" He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Yes." "Joshua's over at the blacksmith's, watching him shoe horses. I thought we might get lunch at the hotel before heading back. Would that be agreeable?" The idea of being seen dining with Frank in public, especially after what she'd just overheard, made Dorothy hesitate. "Perhaps it would be better if I waited in the wagon." Frank's frown deepened. "Miss Turner, someone did upset you. What happened?" Dorothy sighed. "It's nothing truly, just small-town talk. I wouldn't want to create more fodder for gossip." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Ah, the good ladies of Cottonwood Springs have been speculating, have they?" She nodded, embarrassed. Frank's jaw tightened. "Miss Turner, Dorothy, please don't let idle gossip trouble you. You are an employee of the Lazy Bee, and you have every right to dine with your employer and his son without scandal." His use of her first name startled her almost as much as his vehemence. "Mr. Blackburn." "Frank," he corrected. "If I'm to call you Dorothy, you should call me Frank, at least when we're not in front of the men." "Frank," she repeated, feeling strange saying it aloud. "I appreciate your concern, but perhaps it would still be best—" "Nonsense," he interrupted. "I refuse to let small-minded gossips dictate my actions or yours. Now, shall we collect Joshua and have that lunch? I hear the hotel has peach pie today, though I doubt it's as good as yours." His smile was warm, and Dorothy found herself returning it despite her misgivings. "Very well, lunch it is." The hotel dining room fell briefly silent when they entered, confirming Dorothy's fears about becoming the subject of gossip. But Frank's calm demeanor as he seated her and Joshua at a table by the window, his casual conversation, and his evident respect toward her, gradually eased her discomfort. By the time they were enjoying slices of pie, which, as Frank predicted, didn't compare to Dorothy's, she had almost forgotten about the women in the store. Almost. "Pa," Joshua said between bites. "Timmy Wilson says Miss Turner is going to be my new ma. Is that true?" Frank choked on his coffee, and Dorothy froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. "Joshua," Frank said when he'd recovered, "that's not an appropriate question, and Timmy Wilson should mind his own business." "But why not?" Joshua persisted. "Don't you like Miss Turner? She makes the best food, and she reads to me, and she doesn't yell when I get dirty." "Joshua," Frank said firmly, "Miss Turner is our cook. She works for us, that's all." The words, though factually accurate, stung Dorothy more than she would have expected. She set down her fork, suddenly no longer hungry. I think I should wait in the wagon after all," she said quietly. "Thank you for lunch." Before either Blackburn could respond, she rose and walked quickly from the dining room, aware of the curious stares following her exit. Outside, she took deep breaths of the hot summer air, trying to collect herself. What was wrong with her? Of course she was just the cook. That was exactly what she had signed on to be. Why should Frank's reminder of that simple fact upset her? But it had. Because somewhere in these past weeks, Dorothy had begun to feel like more than an employee. She'd begun to feel like part of a family, something she hadn't experienced since losing her parents. And now she realized how dangerous that feeling was, how easily it could lead to heartbreak. She was still standing there when Frank emerged from the hotel, looking troubled. "Dorothy," he began, "I apologize for Joshua's question and for my response. I didn't mean to sound dismissive of you." She shook her head. "No apology necessary. What you said was perfectly correct. I am your cook, that's all." Frank ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the gesture. "That came out wrong. You're more than just anything. You've become important to us, to Joshua especially." "And to you?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Frank looked startled, then thoughtful. "Yes," he said slowly. "To me as well." They stood in silence for a moment, the admission hanging between them. "Pa! Miss Turner!" Joshua burst out of the hotel, breaking the tension. "Can we get candy before we go home, please?" Frank smiled at his son, though the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. "One piece, and only if you promise not to repeat other children's gossip anymore." "I promise," Joshua agreed readily, already heading toward the general store. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the journey into town, with Joshua falling asleep against Dorothy's shoulder about halfway there. Frank drove steadily, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "He's a treasure," Dorothy said softly, looking down at the sleeping boy. Frank glanced over, his expression softening. "He is. He's the best of his mother, and hopefully a little of the good in me, too." "There's plenty of good in you," Dorothy said without thinking. Frank's hands tightened on the reins. "That's kind of you to say, though not everyone would agree." "What do you mean?" He sighed. "I wasn't always the man I am now. After Margaret died, I lost myself for a while. Drank too much, neglected the ranch, worst of all, neglected Joshua." Shame colored his voice. "If not for my foreman, Hank, stepping in, I might have lost everything." Dorothy listened, surprised by his candor. "One night," Frank continued, "I came home late from town, 3 sheets to the wind, found Joshua crying in his bed. He'd had a nightmare, and I wasn't there." His voice grew rough with emotion. "That was my wake-up call. I stopped drinking that night, swore I'd be the father he deserved." "And you have been," Dorothy said gently. Frank shook his head. "I try. Every day, I try. But the truth is, he needs more than just a father. He needs what I can't give him." "A mother," Dorothy supplied. "Yes." Frank glanced at her again, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "But not just any woman, someone special, someone who understands that love isn't just words, it's actions. It's baking bread that tastes like love, as Joshua put it." Dorothy's heart began to beat faster. "Frank, we're almost home," he interrupted, as though suddenly aware he'd said too much. "We should get Joshua to bed." The moment, whatever it had been, passed, and they rode the rest of the way in silence. That night, after Joshua was tucked in and the house quiet, Dorothy sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, trying to make sense of the day's events. Frank had revealed more of himself than ever before, and there had been moments when she thought perhaps he felt something for her beyond appreciation for her cooking. But then he'd withdrawn, retreating behind the wall of employer-employee propriety. And perhaps that was for the best. Dorothy had come west to build a new life, not to lose her heart to a man who might never fully recover from losing his wife. A soft knock at the kitchen door startled her from her thoughts. Frank stood there, looking uncertain. "May I join you?" he asked. Dorothy nodded, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Would you like some tea?" "Please." She poured him a cup, aware of his eyes following her movements. When she sat again, he wrapped his hands around the mug but didn't drink. "I owe you another apology," he said finally. "I've been struggling with certain feelings. It's made me awkward and inconsistent in my behavior towards you." Dorothy's pulse quickened. "What feelings?" Frank met her gaze directly. "Admiration, respect, and something more that I haven't allowed myself to name." He took a breath. "It's been 4 years since Margaret died. I thought that part of me died with her. But then you arrived and Dorothy prompted when he fell silent, "and I find myself looking forward to seeing you each morning, thinking about you when I'm out with the herd, wondering what made you leave Charleston and come all the way to Texas." His smile was self-deprecating. Jealous of my own son because he gets to spend more time with you than I do. Dorothy's hands trembled as she set down her teacup. I didn't know. How could you? I've done everything possible to hide it. Frank ran a hand through his hair. I'm your employer. You depend on me for your livelihood. The last thing I want is for you to feel obligated or uncomfortable. I don't, Dorothy said quickly. Feel uncomfortable, that is. Hope flickered in Frank's eyes. No? She shook her head. No. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the table. Then Frank slowly reached out and took her hand in his. His palm was calloused from ranch work, but his touch was gentle. Dorothy, he said, his voice low, I can't offer courtship right now. Joshua's still adjusting to having you here, and the ranch demands most of my attention. But I want you to know that my feelings for you go beyond appreciation for your cooking or the way you've brightened our home. Dorothy turned her hand to clasp his. I understand, and I feel the same way. Relief and something warmer flooded Frank's expression. You do? Yes, she admitted, though I've been trying not to. He smiled, the first truly unguarded smile she'd seen from him. We make quite a pair, don't we? Both fighting feelings neither of us expected. Indeed we do. Frank squeezed her hand gently, then released it. It's late. We should both get some rest. He stood but hesitated before leaving. May I ask something personal? Of course. What did bring you to Texas, all the way from Charleston? Dorothy sighed, the question she'd been dreading since her arrival. The war, she said simply. My family lost everything, our home, our standing in society. My father died at Gettysburg. My mother held on until 2 years ago, working as a seamstress to keep us afloat. After she passed, there was nothing left for me there but bad memories and crushing debt. Frank's expression softened with understanding. I'm sorry. Don't be. If not for those circumstances, I never would have come west. Never would have found the lazy bee. She smiled slightly. Never would have met you and Joshua. Frank nodded, his eyes warm. Then I'm selfishly grateful, though I'm sorry for your losses. Good night, Frank. Good night, Dorothy. As she watched him go, Dorothy felt something unfurl in her heart, a tender shoot of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she had found not just employment at the Lazy Bee, but a future. August slipped into September, bringing slightly cooler temperatures and the beginning of harvest season. Dorothy threw herself into preserving the bounty from the garden and orchard, canning tomatoes, making apple butter, drying herbs for winter use. The days were long and tiring, but she found deep satisfaction in filling the pantry shelves with colorful jars that would sustain the ranch through the coming winter. Her relationship with Frank remained in a strange limbo, warmer than employer and employee, but carefully circumscribed by mutual agreement. They shared conversations over late-night cups of tea, exchanged meaningful glances across the dinner table, and occasionally, when no one was looking, their hands would brush in passing. But Frank had not pursued formal courtship, and Dorothy had not pressed the issue. Joshua, however, seemed to have his own ideas about their relationship. He had taken to including Dorothy in his bedtime prayers, thanking God for Pa and Miss Turner and everyone at the Lazy Bee. He invited her on fishing expeditions with him and his father, insisted she sit between them at church on Sundays, and once, to Dorothy's mortification and Frank's poorly concealed amusement, had asked the minister if he could marry Pa and Miss Turner right quick after the service. One crisp September morning, Dorothy was in the kitchen preparing for the annual harvest festival in town when Joshua burst in, excitement radiating from every pore. Miss Turner, are you making your apple pie for the contest? Pa says you'll win for sure. Dorothy smiled, wiping flour from her hands. I am indeed, and some peach preserves for the preservation category. Can I help? Joshua bounced on his toes. Of course. You can peel these apples while I finish the crust. They worked companionably, Joshua chattering about the festival activities he was looking forward to, the horse races, the music, the games for children. As he talked, Dorothy noticed he seemed unusually preoccupied, glancing toward the door periodically. Is something wrong, Joshua? She asked finally. He bit his lip. Can I tell you a secret? Of course. I'm helping Pa with a surprise for you. His eyes danced with excitement. It's for the festival, but I'm not supposed to tell you what it is. Dorothy's curiosity was piqued, but she merely smiled. Then I shall look forward to being surprised. The day of the harvest festival dawned clear and cool. Dorothy dressed with special care in her best dress, a blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes. She pinned her hair up neatly and even added a touch of her preciously hoarded rosewater. Frank raised an eyebrow appreciatively when she emerged from her room. You look lovely, he said, his voice warm. Thank you, she replied, trying not to blush like a schoolgirl. Are my pies secure in the wagon? Safe and sound, along with your preserves. He offered his arm. Shall we? The town was transformed for the festival. Bunting and harvest decorations adorned the buildings, and a platform had been erected in the town square for music and announcements. People from surrounding ranches and farms had converged for the celebration, creating a festive atmosphere that was a welcome break from the isolation of ranch life. Dorothy's pies and preserves were promptly entered in their respective contests, and then she was free to enjoy the festivities with Frank and Joshua. They wandered through the various booths and games, stopped to listen to a fiddler playing lively tunes, and watched Joshua participate in a sack race, which he lost with good grace. Throughout the morning, Dorothy noticed Frank seemed unusually nervous, checking his pocket watch frequently and exchanging significant glances with Joshua. She remembered the boys' mention of a surprise and wondered what they could be planning. Just before noon, as they stood watching a horse race at the edge of town, Frank turned to her. Dorothy, would you walk with me for a moment? There's something I'd like to show you. Curious, she agreed. Joshua gave his father a thumbs up and ran off to join some friends, calling over his shoulder that he'd meet them by the contest booth later. Frank led Dorothy away from the crowds toward a small hill overlooking the town. As they crested it, she gasped in surprise. A quilt had been spread on the ground, and a picnic basket sat in the center, along with a small bouquet of wildflowers. What's this? She asked, delighted. Frank smiled, looking both pleased and nervous. A private lunch, away from prying eyes and wagging tongues. They settled on the quilt, and Frank began unpacking the basket, cold fried chicken, biscuits, apple slices, and a bottle of lemonade. Everything was simple, but thoughtfully prepared. Did you make all this? Dorothy asked, impressed. Frank chuckled. I had help from Mrs. Johnson at the hotel. I'm still hopeless in the kitchen, I'm afraid. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, enjoying the view and the gentle breeze. Finally, Frank set aside his plate and turned to face her fully. Dorothy, he began, his voice serious, these past months with you at the Lazy Bee have been transformative for both Joshua and me. Her heart began to beat faster. Frank, please let me finish. He took a deep breath. Before you came, the ranch was just a place we lived and worked. Now it feels like a home again. You've brought warmth and life back into our world, and not just through your cooking. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. I know we agreed to take things slowly, and if you feel it's still too soon, I'll understand. But I can't imagine the Lazy Bee without you now. More importantly, I can't imagine my life without you. Dorothy's hands flew to her mouth as he opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small pearl. It was my grandmother's, Frank explained. Margaret's ring is buried with her as it should be. This represents a new beginning. He took her hand gently. Dorothy Turner, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of making our family complete? Tears sprang to Dorothy's eyes. Oh, Frank. Yes. Yes, I will. His face broke into a radiant smile as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her. May I kiss you? He asked softly. In answer, Dorothy leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle and sweet, a promise of the life they would build together. When they finally drew apart, Frank rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Dorothy. I think I have since the moment Joshua declared your bread tasted like love. She laughed softly. I love you too, though I must admit I wasn't sure you'd ever say those words. I'm a slow and cautious man, Frank admitted with a rueful smile. Too cautious, perhaps, but I'm certain about this about us. They gathered up the picnic and made their way back to the festival hand in hand, both unable to stop smiling. Joshua spotted them immediately and came running. Did you ask her? Did she say yes? He demanded, looking from one to the other. Frank laughed. Yes to both questions, son. Joshua let out a whoop that turned heads throughout the square. I knew it. I told Timmy Wilson you were going to be my new ma. Dorothy knelt down to his level. Is that all right with you, Joshua? If I become your mother? The boy's expression turned serious. My real ma is in heaven. Pa says she watches over me from there. He paused, thoughtful beyond his years. But I think she'd want me to have a ma here, too. Someone to make bread that tastes like love and read me stories and stuff. Dorothy felt tears threatening again. I would be honored to be that person for you. Joshua threw his arms around her neck in a fierce hug. Good, 'cause I already love you like a ma. Over the boy's shoulder, Dorothy met Frank's gaze. His eyes were suspiciously bright as he watched his son embrace his future wife. The announcement of their engagement spread quickly through the festival. Most reactions were congratulatory, though Dorothy noticed the two women from the general store looked sour as they offered stiff felicitations. Told you she was setting her cap for him, one muttered to the other as they walked away. Frank, overhearing, squeezed Dorothy's hand. Pay them no mind. They're just jealous because I chose the most beautiful, kind-hearted woman in the county. Later that afternoon, as they gathered for the contest results, Dorothy was shocked to hear her name called as the winner of not only the pie competition, but also the preserves category. The judges said your apple pie was the best they'd tasted in 20 years, the mayor announced, presenting her with 2 blue ribbons. And those peach preserves? Mrs. Blackburn, you've set a new standard for our harvest festival. Dorothy blushed at being addressed as Mrs. Blackburn before the wedding had even taken place, but Frank looked pleased. As they walked back to the wagon with Joshua running ahead, Frank put his arm around her waist. You know, he said conversationally, I was planning to propose regardless, but winning those contests just confirms what I already knew. I'm marrying the finest cook in Texas. Dorothy laughed. Is that why you're marrying me? For my cooking? Frank stopped walking and turned her to face him. I'm marrying you, Dorothy Turner, because you make me happier than I ever thought possible after losing Margaret, because you love my son as though he were your own, because you're strong and brave and kind. He touched her cheek gently. The fact that you cook like an angel is just a fortunate bonus. Smooth talker, she teased, but her heart swelled with joy. Only with you, he replied, and kissed her right there in the middle of town, blue ribbons and all. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a flurry of preparations. Dorothy and Frank had agreed on a simple ceremony in late October before the winter weather set in. The ranch hands, to Dorothy's surprise and delight, threw themselves into helping fixing up the house, building new furniture for the married couple's bedroom, and even planning a small addition to the house for the following spring. In case the family grows, old Hank had said with a wink that made Dorothy blush furiously. Joshua was equally enthusiastic, proudly telling everyone who would listen that Miss Turner was going to be his mother. He helped Dorothy sew curtains for their refreshed home and insisted on learning to make his father's favorite biscuits so he could surprise him on special occasions. One evening, about a week before the wedding, Dorothy was putting the finishing touches on her wedding dress, a simple but elegant ivory gown she'd made herself, when a knock came at her door. Come in, she called, hastily covering the dress. Frank entered, looking unusually serious. Dorothy, there's something I need to discuss with you. Concern flickered through her. Is something wrong? No, nothing's wrong. He sat on the edge of her bed, careful to maintain a respectful distance. It's about the wedding, or rather, after the wedding. Dorothy's cheeks warmed as she realized what he might be referring to. Oh, Frank smiled slightly at her blush. Not that. Well, not just that. He took her hand. I want to take you on a wedding trip, just for a few days, to San Antonio. Joshua will stay with Hank and his wife. A wedding trip? Dorothy repeated, surprised and touched. But what about the ranch? The ranch will survive without us for 4 days, Frank assured her. Hank ran it for months when I was struggling after Margaret died. He can certainly manage a few days now. Dorothy squeezed his hand. That sounds wonderful. I've never been to San Antonio. I want to give you something special, Frank said softly. You deserve a proper honeymoon, not just moving your things upstairs and continuing to cook for a house full of hungry cowboys. I don't need anything fancy, Dorothy protested. I know you don't. That's one of the many reasons I love you. Frank brought her hand to his lips. But I want to do this for you, for us. A fresh start, with memories that are just ours. Dorothy's heart swelled with love for this man who understood her so well. Thank you, Frank. It's a perfect gift. He smiled, relieved. Good. It's all arranged tickets on the stage, a room at the Menger Hotel. We leave the day after the wedding. Dorothy laughed. You were that confident I'd agree? Hopeful, he corrected, and prepared to be very persuasive if necessary. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and crisp, with just enough bite in the air to herald the approaching winter. Dorothy stood at her window, watching the sun rise over the land that had become her home, scarcely able to believe how much her life had changed in just a few short months. From desperate job seeker to beloved bride, it seemed like something from a novel, not the life of Dorothy Turner from Charleston. Yet, here she was, about to become Mrs. Frank Blackburn, mistress of the Lazy Bee Ranch and mother to a wonderful boy who had already claimed her heart. There was a soft knock at her door, and one of the ranch hands' wives, who had come to help her prepare, entered with a breakfast tray. Can't have the bride fainting from hunger during the ceremony, Mrs. Rodriguez said cheerfully. Mr. Blackburn insisted I bring you this, said it's only fair you get waited on for once since you've been feeding everyone else for months. Dorothy smiled, touched by Frank's thoughtfulness. The tray held coffee, fresh biscuits, scrambled eggs, and a single wildflower in a small glass. How is he this morning? She asked as she sipped her coffee. Mrs. Rodriguez grinned. Nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs, changed his shirt twice already, according to Joshua. The thought of steady, confident Frank being nervous made Dorothy's heart flutter with affection. And Joshua? That boy is beside himself with excitement. He's been polishing his good boots since dawn and asking every 5 minutes if it's time to go to town yet. The wedding was to be held in the small church in Cottonwood Springs at noon, followed by a celebration at the Lazy Bee for the ranch hands and neighbors. It was a simple affair by Eastern standards, but perfect for Dorothy and Frank. As the hour approached, Dorothy donned her wedding dress with Mrs. Rodriguez's help. The ivory fabric, ordered specially from a catalog and sewn painstakingly by hand, fell in simple, elegant lines. Her dark hair was arranged in a neat chignon, adorned with small white flowers from the garden. You look beautiful, Mrs. Rodriguez declared, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Mr. Blackburn won't know what hit him. The ride to town seemed both interminable and too short. Dorothy's stomach fluttered with nerves and excitement as the church came into view, its small bell tower rising against the clear blue sky. A crowd had gathered outside, not just the invited guests, but townspeople curious to witness the union of the Lazy Bee's owner and his cook. Inside, the church was decorated simply with autumn flowers and ribbons. As Dorothy stood at the back, arm linked with Hank's, who had proudly agreed to give her away, she caught her first glimpse of Frank standing at the altar. He was dressed in a new black suit, his hair neatly combed, his beard trimmed. But it was the expression on his face as he turned and saw her that she would remember forever, a look of such wonder and love that it brought tears to her eyes. Joshua stood beside his father as best man, practically bouncing with excitement in his Sunday best. When he spotted Dorothy, he gave her an enthusiastic thumbs up that made several guests chuckle. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Dorothy remembered the weight of Frank's hands holding hers, the warmth in his voice as he repeated his vows, the slight tremble in her own as she promised to love and honor him. And then the minister was pronouncing them husband and wife, and Frank was kissing her with restrained tenderness that nevertheless promised more when they were alone. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Frank Blackburn, the minister announced to applause and cheers. As they turned to face their guests, Joshua darted forward and threw his arms around both of them. "We're a real family now," he declared. Frank lifted his son into his arms, his other arm around Dorothy's waist. "Yes, we are, son, the three of us together." The celebration at the ranch lasted well into the evening. Tables had been set up in the yard, laden with food prepared by Dorothy and the neighboring women. There was music from a fiddle and harmonica, dancing on a wooden platform the men had constructed, and more laughter than the lazy bee had heard in years. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit, casting a golden glow over the festivities. Dorothy, who had changed from her wedding dress into a simpler blue frock, found herself watching her new husband across the yard. He was talking with some of the neighboring ranchers, his face animated in a way she'd rarely seen before. "He's happier than I've ever seen him," Hank said, coming to stand beside her. "You've done that, Mrs. Blackburn." The new name still gave her a thrill. "We've done it for each other," she corrected gently. Hank nodded, his weathered face softening. "I watched him nearly destroy himself after Margaret died. Wasn't sure he'd ever pull through. But he did, for Joshua's sake." The old foreman smiled at her. "And then you came along with your bread that tastes like love, and, well, you've healed something in both of them." Dorothy blinked back tears. "Thank you, Hank. That means more than you know." Frank caught sight of them and excused himself from his conversation. As he approached, his eyes never left Dorothy's face. "May I have this dance with my wife?" he asked, extending his hand. "You certainly may," she replied, placing her hand in his. He led her to the makeshift dance floor, where the musicians were playing a slow waltz. As they moved together under the stars, Frank pulled her closer than was strictly proper. "Happy, Mrs. Blackburn?" he murmured near her ear. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she confessed. "And you?" "I have everything I could ever want right here," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "You, Joshua, our home. It's more than I dared hope for after losing Margaret." Dorothy rested her head against his shoulder as they swayed to the music. "I used to think coming west was just about survival. I never dreamed I'd find love here." "Love found you," Frank corrected, "the moment you stepped into our kitchen with your carpetbag and determination." Later that night, after the guests had departed and Joshua was tucked in bed, after extracting promises that they wouldn't leave for San Antonio until he was awake to say goodbye, Frank carried Dorothy across the threshold of their bedroom, not her small room off the kitchen, but the master bedroom, freshly painted and furnished for their new life together. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackburn," he said softly, setting her on her feet. Dorothy looked around the room, taking in the new curtains she'd sewn, the quilt Joshua had helped her select, the sturdy furniture built by loving hands. But mostly, she looked at Frank, her husband, and felt a rush of love so powerful it nearly took her breath away. "Home," she agreed, reaching for him. At last. San Antonio was a revelation to Dorothy. After months at the isolated ranch, the bustling city with its mix of American, Mexican, and European influences seemed almost overwhelming. They stayed at the Menger Hotel, a luxurious establishment that made Dorothy feel like a princess in a fairy tale. Frank delighted in showing her the city, the historic Alamo, the colorful market square, the beautiful San Fernando Cathedral. They ate in restaurants, attended a theater performance, and strolled along the river that wound through the heart of the city. But the most precious moments were the quiet ones in their hotel room, learning each other as husband and wife, sharing secrets and dreams in the intimate darkness. Frank confessed his fears about being a good husband again, about balancing his responsibilities to the ranch with his devotion to her. Dorothy admitted her occasional homesickness for Charleston, not as it was now, but as it had been in her childhood. "Would you like to visit someday?" Frank asked, tracing patterns on her bare shoulder as they lay in bed. Dorothy considered the question. "Perhaps someday. But the lazy bee is my home now. You and Joshua are my family." He kissed her tenderly. "We always will be." On their last night in San Antonio, as they prepared for bed, Dorothy felt a sudden wave of emotion. "What is it, love?" Frank asked, noticing the tears in her eyes. "I was just thinking about how much my life has changed. 6 months ago, I stepped off that stagecoach with nothing but a carpetbag and my mother's recipe book. I was so desperate, so afraid." She looked up at him with shining eyes. "And now, I have everything I never dared to dream of." Frank gathered her into his arms. "You came looking for a job, and you found a family. All because Joshua said my bread tasted like love." Dorothy laughed softly. "Smart boy, my son," Frank murmured against her hair. "He recognized what I was too stubborn to see right away, that you were exactly what we needed." Their return to the Lazy Bee was met with enthusiasm from Joshua, who had apparently extracted a promise from Hank to teach him to rope calves in their absence. He chattered excitedly about his adventures while they were gone, but it was clear he was overjoyed to have them home. "Did you bring me anything?" he asked hopefully. Frank laughed. "As a matter of fact, we did." He produced a small package containing a wooden snake that wiggled realistically when held by its tail. Joshua's eyes widened with delight. "This is even better than candy. Thanks, Pa. Thanks, Ma." It was the first time he had called her Ma without prompting, and Dorothy felt her heart swell. She knelt and hugged him tightly. "You're very welcome, sweetheart." Life settled into a new rhythm after the wedding. Dorothy still cooked for the ranch hands, but now she did so as the mistress of the Lazy Bee, not as an employee. She took on more responsibilities, keeping the books for the ranch, handling correspondence, and making decisions alongside Frank about their growing operation. As winter descended on the Texas plains, the Blackburn family found warmth in their togetherness. Evening meals were filled with conversation and laughter. Joshua's reading improved dramatically under Dorothy's patient tutelage. Frank, who had always been respected by his men, now seemed to walk with a new confidence, as though the happiness of his home life had strengthened him for the challenges of running the ranch. Christmas that year was a celebration unlike any the Lazy Bee had seen since before Margaret's death. Dorothy decorated the house with evergreen boughs, red ribbons, and candles. She baked cookies and cakes, roasted a turkey, and prepared all the traditional fixings. The ranch hands were invited for Christmas dinner, and each received a hand-knitted scarf Dorothy had worked on secretly for weeks. For Joshua, there were new books, a hand-carved chess set Frank had commissioned from a craftsman in San Antonio, and a puppy, a black and white border collie mix that the boy immediately named Ranger. "He'll be a fine cattle dog when he's grown," Frank explained as Joshua rolled on the floor with his new companion. Dorothy received a beautiful silver locket containing a tiny photograph of Frank and Joshua, and Frank opened his gift from her to find a finely crafted leather journal. "For your thoughts," she explained softly. "You mentioned once that you wished you'd kept better memories of Joshua's early years for him to read someday." Frank's eyes grew suspiciously bright. "It's perfect," he said, pulling her close for a kiss that made Joshua giggle and cover Ranger's eyes. That night, after Joshua was asleep and the house quiet, Dorothy and Frank sat before the fire in the parlor, content in each other's company. "I have one more gift for you," Dorothy said suddenly, reaching for his hand. Frank looked surprised. "You've already given me more than enough," she smiled mysteriously. "This one couldn't be wrapped." Taking a deep breath, she placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby, Frank. Next summer." For a moment, he stared at her in shock. Then a slow, radiant smile spread across his face. "A baby. You're certain?" Dorothy nodded, tears of joy filling her eyes. "The doctor in San Antonio confirmed it when I visited him while you were at that cattle auction. I wanted to be sure before I told you." Frank gathered her into his arms, his own eyes wet. "Oh, Dorothy, I didn't think it was possible to be happier than I already was, but you keep proving me wrong." He kissed her deeply, then pulled back to look into her eyes. "Boy or girl, it doesn't matter. Our child will be loved beyond measure." "Just like its mother," Dorothy whispered. "Just like its mother," Frank agreed, kissing her again. They told Joshua the next morning. He was initially confused, then excited beyond words at the prospect of a brother or sister. "I hope it's a brother," he declared, "but a sister would be okay too, I guess, as long as she doesn't touch my things." Frank laughed. "That's very generous of you, son." Joshua looked thoughtful. "The baby will need a room. Can I help build it?" "You certainly can," Frank assured him. "We'll start the addition to the house as soon as the weather warms up." As winter gave way to spring, Dorothy's body began to change, the gentle swell of her belly a source of wonder and joy for the whole family. Frank was attentive to the point of hovering, insisting she rest more and delegate some of her kitchen duties to Mrs. Rodriguez, who was hired to help 3 days a week. "I'm pregnant, not an invalid," Dorothy protested one evening as Frank insisted on rubbing her feet after dinner. "Humor me," he replied with a smile. "I missed this part with Joshua. His mother wouldn't let me fuss over her either." Dorothy softened, understanding his need to be involved. "Very well, but only because your foot rubs are so wonderful." Joshua was equally protective, proudly announcing to everyone in town that his ma was having a baby and he was going to be a big brother. He took his new responsibilities seriously, reading books about babies from the school library and helping Dorothy whenever he could. One evening in late April, as Dorothy sat on the porch watching the sunset, Frank joined her with 2 glasses of lemonade. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, handing her a glass. She smiled, taking a sip. "I was just thinking about everything that's happened since I arrived here. It's not even been a year, yet my life has transformed completely." Frank settled beside her, his hand finding hers. "Do you ever regret it? Coming west? Marrying a widower with a son and a ranch to run?" "Never," Dorothy said firmly. "Not for a single moment." She placed their joined hands on her rounded belly, where the baby was kicking vigorously. "This is exactly where I'm meant to be." Frank's face softened with love. "Do you know, the day you arrived, when Joshua declared your bread tasted like love, I thought he was just being a child, saying something fanciful." He shook his head in wonder. "But he was right. There was love in everything you did, even then. Love you put into your cooking because that's who you are, a woman with enough love to heal a broken family and make it whole again." Dorothy leaned against his shoulder, content beyond words. "And you, Frank Blackburn, are a man with enough love to give a desperate woman a chance, to open your home and eventually your heart to someone who needed both more than you could know." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the day end and thinking of all the tomorrows that awaited them. In July of 1879, as summer heat once again shimmered above the dusty roads of Cottonwood Springs, Dorothy gave birth to a healthy baby girl they named Margaret Rose Blackburn, honoring Frank's first wife while looking toward their future together. Joshua was enchanted with his baby sister, proudly helping to rock her cradle and singing off-key lullabies that nevertheless seemed to soothe the infant. Frank was a doting father, as attentive to his daughter as he was to his son, and more in love with his wife than ever. And Dorothy, who had once stepped off a stagecoach with nothing but hope and determination, now held in her arms the physical embodiment of the love she had found at the Lazy Bee Ranch, all because her bread had tasted like love to a hungry boy who recognized what his father needed before he knew it himself. As she sat in the rocking chair by the window, nursing her daughter while Joshua read aloud from his primer and Frank worked at his desk nearby, Dorothy looked around at her family and thought that sometimes the ingredients for happiness were simpler than anyone realized. Flour and water, yes, but mostly love, kneaded with patient hands and shared with an open heart. That was the real recipe, the one her mother had taught her, the one she would pass on to her children. Not just how to make bread, but how to make a home, how to create family from strangers, how to recognize love when it appeared in unexpected places. Like a dusty Texas ranch called the Lazy Bee, where a cook had become a wife, a mother, and the heart of a home that would flourish for generations to come.